So, as some of you might be aware, last year the UK went into lockdown because of this pandemic. There was this feeling like everything had come to a stop, just the entire country just ground to a halt. Time just completely paused as people just stayed inside their homes, only venturing out like your Captain Scott on his last ill-fated expedition to the Arctic. I'm just going outside and there may be some time. Don't use the toilet paper mountain without me. The streets were dead, so much so that wild deer wandered past our house and ended up taking up residence on the outside verges of my town's college, which is in the centre of my town of about 40,000 people. They were just living on the road. My partner started working from home. I lost my part-time job. We were stuck and confined to the house for 24 hours of the day, aside from our one allotted exercise break. I didn't take exercise breaks because I'm clinically vulnerable. So I was extremely aware that I did not want to go outside at all and ruin my brain. And personally, I didn't necessarily immediately feel the despair that everyone around me seemed to be falling into. So I've spent the better part of 4 years working on and off around my disability. So I've largely been stuck inside the home with limited money. So lockdown was simply me returning to a place I had become resigned to. And then the men came to my house. So it was an otherwise completely repetitive, mundane day. I think it was early summer, and it was exactly the same day as the one before it and the one after. I can't even remember whether it was the weekend or the week, because all the days of lockdown just blurred into one solid block of time. So I think I was just scrolling through Tumblr mindlessly, listening to a podcast or my hyperfixation that was getting me through lockdown, which was Depeche Mode. And there was a knock at the door, like. So, oh goody, an event, something different was happening. Maybe it was a delivery, maybe it was a family member dropping off something new and exciting for the house, just anything that would make that day different from any other day of that week. As I opened the front door, and I'm like, oh, new faces! There was a car that was driven onto our private driveway. It's why we have our house, so it has a private driveway for my car. And there was a car on it, and it'd been parked, so it was blocking anyone on the street from seeing our front door or the front step. Not that there was anyone who was out looking at our house, because no one was outside. So there was no one on the street, there was no one walking past, there was no one around at all. But there was a man in this car watching me and watching his mate who'd come up to our door. And I opened the door, and he steps up, maskless, to stand about this far away from my bare, clinically vulnerable face. And he's there, and he's like, aren't you prepared for me? I'm the gardener for our street. I'm here to clear the driveway. I've lived in our neighbourhood for 4 years, and I had never seen this man in my life before.
I don't know you!
We are not a maintained street. A council doesn't send people to do driveways. There's no driveway clearance scheme here. So I stepped back, little confused. I hadn't asked for a gardening service, and I didn't want one. So I grow the weeds and wildflowers out on our driveway on purpose. But he goes, no, you don't understand. He was going to clear our driveway. And he stood, and he moves closer towards me, and I start to panic. I am at increased risk. If I catch COVID, it's very bad for me. So I said I wasn't comfortable with him because he's not wearing a mask. Can you step back and please leave? So he calls me stupid and told me he's going to clear the driveway. There was no one else other than his friend in his car who was blocking our driveway, who was able to see what was happening. My partner was upstairs working. I'm stuck, alone, and facing a man who would not leave. And he's backed up by another man, pinning me into my home. My response was very stupid. I'm not good when I feel backed into a corner, and I'm also incredibly stubborn, and I don't tend to back down once my hackles have been raised. You can blame my stepfather for that. That's a nice way of saying I got very, very angry immediately. I went from naught and scared to woof. These men had come to my home, potentially infecting me with a disease I was very vulnerable to, for the purpose of forcing me into giving them money to do a job I didn't want doing. So I blew up. I told them to fuck off. I told them to get out my fucking face and off my property. And it's sad to say I've been called a bitch enough and had to deal with angry, threatening men enough that in the moment I'm mostly immune to it. My adrenaline kept me running until I knew that they had gone, but it dropped back down to like empty, gasping fear pretty quickly once they had driven off, because they knew my home, they knew my face, they knew my car. What was stopping them from coming back at any time they wanted? Had they seen me before? Did they know I was vulnerable? Did they mark me out as someone unable to defend myself? Did they think I was on my own? And I sat, right down about there, I sat down and I shook and I cried. And all these thoughts were circulating in my head because my grandparents live a single street away from me. And I thought about these men pulling into the driveway and doing the same routine with the same threat. So what I did, like any white woman online, I pulled out my phone and I made a post on a local Facebook group, and I put in as much detail as I could remember and a warning about what these guys tried to do, in the hope it might connect with someone else or someone who cared about someone who was as potentially vulnerable as I was. And didn't think it would get the reaction that it did. Over the rest of the day, it was shared and spread hundreds of times within my hometown, and I got a lot of messages. And what was interesting was there was a divide in the responses by gender. From other women, there was this outpouring of support for what I had gone through. They shared my warning, they thanked me for thinking about others, and they wanted to know that I was safe, that I was okay, or they told me about similar experiences they had had, either with other tradespeople or with those two same men who pulled the same routine, the same threat that's not an explicit threat, the same picking out of people. You think, aha, there are other people like me. Okay, it's not me being crazy. And then came the other side. Every single cis man who saw what I had been through reacted hostilely. Their instinctive reaction was to completely disbelieve me. They called me a liar, a fantasist, that I was just looking to stir and make trouble for some innocent guys who were just honestly trying to help. My story was unbelievable. I changed the details too much. I'm just another bitchy feminist. I received abusive messages from so many men trying to force me to retract what I'd said that it just got to the point where my partner had to take my phone away because I could not handle the garbage being thrown at me. I knew what happened to me But every fundamental of my story was picked apart, doubted, misinterpreted, and taken as a sign of a personal failing within myself. It didn't matter how unsafe those men had made me feel, the red flags, the sea of red flags that I had experienced, or my own need to find security by ensuring the safety of others. I was just another woman making trouble by speaking out about the behaviour of cis men.
We have about 600,000 unique listeners for every single episode, and then each month we get about 9 million downloads.
Like many other women, I have a long-standing interest in true crime. I've always been drawn to the darker side of human nature. Maybe it's because many of the significant times in my developing years are marked by my very vivid memories of media coverage of prominent cases. The death of Stuart Lubbock, the disappearance and murder of Sarah Payne, being within 20 miles of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells and staying with a friend and being the same age as them, and just being so incredibly scared that it was going to happen to me, to the cases of Madeleine McCann and Steve Wright when I was a teenager. My interest for true crime grew as I became interested in the Whitechapel murders of the late 19th century. Cringe, I even called myself a ripperologist in my college application essay for reasons I don't understand.
Cringe. There's no other word for it. This makes me cringe. It's embarrassing.
And I took my current partner, like on our first date, to an exhibition of selected items from the Black Museum. So if you've not heard of the Black Museum before, it's the evidence lockup from the London Met of their most notorious cases. There's no better way, in my opinion, to judge how serious a man is about dating you than like, oh, you see that lump of hair? That's from the Crippen murder. Oh, that's the ricin pellet used to kill Georgi Markov. And yeah, that's the glove and aprons used by the acid bath murderer. While Tudor history is my deepest and most beloved hyperfixation, true crime carries with it the areas I am most passionate about when I study history. True crime is an intersection where social, personal, gender, racial, national, spiritual, and sexual concepts unique to a society and a time period collide, presenting like a snapshot that highlights any tensions, changes, and facets of a period within a microcosm. True crime may be sordid or tragic or macabre, often carrying a layer of detached gore and disgust that humans are drawn towards, and more often than not, true crime is the story of women. To me, it's no surprise that women are such prolific consumers of true crime. There aren't many spaces in the media landscape that are curated for the interests of women without being mocked. In my other guises, when I put on one of my other hats, I am a prolific fan of romance novels, and well, is there any form of media or literature more derided than the romance genre? Despite how wide and vast and encompassing and diverse and successful it is. Pop music, reality TV, despite being immensely popular and profitable, are not respected in the slightest. Even my eternal beloved were teeny bop until, grown men started listening to it. Now it's good. But true crime is acceptable. It's scientific, it's serious, it avoids the for women tag, and it can be reproduced to fit every need, culture, and context. If you want true crime focusing only on Australia, you got it. Historical true crime recreations? Done. In-depth looking into cases focusing on every details? Sure. Reassessment of crime to look at a different angle? Yep. Comedic looks, white-collar crime that leads to murder, cons, fraud, supernatural, Hollywood-specific, cults, female criminals only, unexplained mysteries, the experience of being just two pals and swapping gossip? You got it. What I think makes true crime a genre driven and made for women is in the power of shared trauma. True crime often most focuses on murder, and this is an act which is most often committed against the societal other. Women, persons of colour, the queer community, the disabled, sex workers, indigenous people, the disabled. As a queer disabled woman, I have often been afraid or been in danger by the simple act of existing. I've regularly faced queerphobic abuse and threats of violence, and true crime often shines a light on experiences that are otherwise not tolerated, not spoken of, or not welcomed as part of mainstream society. The cases curated and presented not only discuss the realities of many communities around the world to highlight real lived experiences, but encourage the audience to sympathise and identify with the victims of these acts, or to indulge that your experiences do not happen in isolation. These podcasts, documentaries, articles, and subreddits can be like a shared safe space where members of other communities can see open discussions of their trauma that take place in the open, without shame, without fear, without disgust. As a woman, I've always found there's a pervasive thread in our society that trains women to not be believed and to accept that as a reality. The undercurrent of misogyny on the emotionally and inherently untrustworthiness of women that has been a bedrock of Western society for hundreds of years has resulted in growing up with the expectation that no one is going to want to believe the things you might say, notice, or live through. A male teacher will make a comment about the length of your skirt and the size of your legs. A friend of the family your parents insist that you call uncles will comment you're developing nicely. Your male boss stands too close. A boyfriend makes rape jokes. An anonymous figure in a crowd takes the opportunity to grope you on a bus. Your male friends will not understand that the guy you find creepy a dozen tiny ways that add up to you being unable to trust him. Sharing even the most minor of any of those experiences or those like it is met with distrust, disbelief, the insistence that you are wrong. This did not happen this way. You are misremembering. You're making something up. You're seeing something that could not be there. So you learn to suppress. You learn to ignore. You learn to be a nice girl who doesn't make waves. You're up for a laugh. You're edgy in all the right waves, and you don't ever complain because what else can you do? But true crime sells the feeling of implicit belief. There is no comfort more overwhelming than knowing you are right. What happened to you was real. You're not alone. Those creep vibes you pick up, they're real, they're genuine tactics, they're part of a wider picture. Those signs you knew to avoid can add up to something dangerous, and what happened to you was not acceptable. Your trauma is not only yours to bear, it is a weight shared by so many others and by a community who want to be there, who want to support you, and who will stand with you when needed. For some, listening to true crime and how it relates to their own experiences or their own trauma can be healing in its own way. We grieve for those who are lost and who were otherwise ignored. We reach out with our pain to those who carry the same burden and carry recognition. We see others. In a world that downplays, ridicules, and demands we rebrand our experiences as lies, true crime is a place that welcomes and sees us. What happened was not your fault. It's the fault of a system that too often protects and shields those who do wrong.
There's this beautiful thing about podcasting. It's a special medium where you feel like you are connected to your co-host or to the host that you're hearing.
In the past 2 years, both Netflix and the BBC have produced what can be claimed to be definitive documentaries detailing the crimes of Peter Sutcliffe, an English serial killer who stalked, attacked, and murdered women in the north of England through the 1970s to the early 1980s. I've already talked about him before in my Cops Can Have a Little Brutality as a Treat Life on Mars video.
Synergized content. You love to see it.
And for me, there is no better example of how the ethics of true crime can be manipulated and used against those it purports to champion. The BBC series The Yorkshire Files, a very British crime story, is a masterclass in documentary making that I really would advise you to seek out and watch. Liza Williams uses the 3-hour series to discuss the attitudes of society and the police around women, poverty, class and respectability, and how those prejudices contributed to a situation that actively prevented Sutcliffe from being caught, despite him being a very known element to police and being identified in, I think it's 4 or 5 different lines of inquiry. He was interviewed about 9 times before they got him, and that was by chance. The series focuses on the lives and experiences of the women that Sutcliffe targeted. Not only the women who lost their lives, but their families too, as well as victims who were ignored by the police, and to those who lived through years of preventable terror and fear. The police were just as predatory and misogynistic as Sutcliffe. The women they used for their own motivations targeted and exploited by a system that saw them as having no intrinsic value. It presents modern society as one that systematically fails the most vulnerable amongst us and has not improved since the days when the government attempted to hide the failings of the police by attempting to prevent Sutcliffe from even being put on trial. It is a discussion of why these crimes happened, why in this particular place, and why the police failed and will keep failing. The Netflix series was perhaps one of the most frustrating things I've ever watched, to the point where I was unable to finish watching the final episode. While Liza Williams focused on the humanity of the women targeted, the inherent value of their lives, and the tragedy that they were sacrificed to appease police and media narratives around sex workers, the Netflix documentary robs each of the women Sutcliffe killed of the last tangible aspects of their humanity. The women who died flash by, their lives, their values, their great hopes, abandoned in a cheap focus on the violence done to their bodies in death, their last moments wrung out as they are presented as so much meat and cheap violence to shock the viewer with the grisliness of their end. As they were exploited in life, so they are exploited in death, with a series relying on the cheapest of modern storytelling tropes, the twist!
What a twist!
The first half of this 4-hour show are taken from the police viewpoint, detailing how it was difficult and it was hard to hunt for Peter Sutcliffe with a litany of cheap excuses. He was using the motorway. The police force was reshuffled. People gave them too much information. There was too much paperwork until the rug is pulled out. And actually, the police were making mistakes all along. Here's a prominent TERF and campaigner against sex workers to tell us how the police were wrong. I'm sure she has a meaningful commentary on this situation to give us. And by the time that they highlight the police failings, the damage has already been done. The victims have already been dismissed and presented as objects to be gawped at. The police have already been presented as naive innocents and hard done by. The framing has already been focused on removing empathy from the women targeted and towards those who failed them. It is another way to rid those lost of their agency and present them as being complicit within their own murder. And that is the other side of true crime. Where do we draw the line between reality and a dark crime fantasy that belies the trends that produce crime to profit from them? There's a comfy sort of dark, gritty crime story. It presents a figure of unparalleled intelligence with a fiendishly clever plan, manipulating and orchestrating events to fit their own twisted version of the world, a puppet master who can only be caught if one is prepared to step inside their world and hunt them as relentlessly as they hunt their victims. There are no unconnected events in the world, only pawns being moved about on a gigantic 5-dimensional chessboard by minds of sheer brilliance that are lurking behind every corner. The deaths of murder victims are imbued with a grand cosmic meaning, rather than being mundane examples of the cruelty of modern society. It is comforting to divorce crime from our world. It presents the worst of crimes as only being done by the bad people over there, who are very definitely bad, very bad, and can be shamed and driven from our world. The bad people might be insane or have complex intellectual motivations that cannot be understood by conventional minds. Thomas Harris has created a consuming pop media monster with Hannibal Lecter, as his charisma and horror have become the expectation of how we see certain kinds of criminals. We now expect killers to be made from the mould that Hannibal was born from, the vast sea of humanity that just sometimes creates a person who wants to kill in meticulously, intellectually planned ways, instead of discussing and exploring how our society breeds the conditions for crime and murder. Our society is steeped in queerphobia, misogyny, systemic racism, systemic ableism. There is implicit inequality in a capitalist system that encourages sympathy for those at the top and sneering hatred for those at the bottom. Poverty, lack of access to education, and a prison system that does nothing to support reform and lift up those incarcerated work to keep people in an underclass from which it's very hard to rise from. It is much easier for us to imagine the urbane serial killer plotting out how to kill women whose names all line up to spell out the favourite opera of a police detective he's choosing to challenge, rather to acknowledge that huge amounts of women are killed by their partners because, well, those men see their female partners as expendable facets of their own identity to discard as they see fit as consequence of growing up within a patriarchal society. Sex workers are targeted because violence towards them is acceptable. It is a consequence of their bad behaviour, and their expendability is taken for granted. Black, Hispanic, Latina, Asian and Indigenous women are killed at appalling rates because they're seen as subhuman, as fetish objects, or characterised by emotions that are not normal. They are ignorable and not seen to represent our communities. Queer people are abhorrents who bring violence on themselves simply by existing. That's what I was told after being threatened with violence by a homophobic neighbour. Police officer with the nerve to wear a rainbow flag pin told me there was nothing to be done. Having abuse shouted at me in the street and being told I should get my face smashed in for living in my home was justified because, well, I made my neighbour feel worried first, so they both evened out. It was okay. A narrative with a monster must have a monster hunter, no matter how many times those monster hunters are complicit through negligence, ignorance, prejudice, or being directly involved. Let's not forget who the Golden State Rapist was.
He's a cop. He's a cop!
You a cop?
The police do not seek to protect those who are not valued by our society and are dedicated to maintaining the status quo, not fighting for justice. How many cases have lain unsolved and unresolved due to the actions of the police? We don't need that evidence. We don't want to take that witness statement. The victim deserved it because they were black. The husband couldn't do it because he was a police officer. He's my mate. He looks like a nice guy. Acknowledging the failures and complicity of the police would be to acknowledge that our systems of justice do not offer resolution for the vast majority of us and do not serve to function in avoiding criminal behaviour. Those issues got to be pushed aside to create a simple, digestible narrative that has beginning, middle and definitive ending. The expected violence of the police must be ignored, or we look too closely at ourselves and our acceptance of their behaviour. And there is the nature of capitalism and true crime itself. By turning true crime into a profit-driven genre, trauma is repackaged as a consumable object that can be discarded and not returned to. viewers are lured in by the lurid, the extreme, the shocking, and then once it's done, they turn to the next new story. There is a value in sharing our stories and highlighting the experiences of those in underrepresented communities, but where do we draw the line? Is there even one? Hosts and researchers deserve compensation, but how much profit is too much profit? How far is too far? It can be hard to navigate the true crime genre while feeling you are maintaining a sense of personal ethics and that you are actively avoiding the attitudes that breed into perpetuating the conditions that allow these sorts of crimes to take place. There are so many white women in the true crime genre that are content to profit up packaging up the most appalling crimes done to women of colour or trans women as comedy, as a place to have a cheeky glass of wine, a cheeky prosecco at the end of the day, and gossip and bitch and giggle over vicious acts of inhumanity done to those who need our support, our anger, and our protection most. Because, well, those kinds of things never happen to them. They're good girls. They will never be on the margins of society. They will never be driven to desperation. Their humanity is never in question. They have the ability to look at these events and know they will always be safe. I cannot imagine the lack of empathy it takes to look at these sorts of events and the most awful, the worst moments of a person's life and make jokes about it for money. It is another face of the worst aspects of our society, upholding the fear and disgust that sees so many marginalised people targeted as receptacles of hate and violence, only with the thin veneer of girl boss feminism because it's women doing it. There is a particular episode of a true crime podcast that I want to discuss as I close my thoughts on what true crime can mean to women. So I will admit to liking and following a podcast called Crime Junkie, which is, just FYI, that is a terrible name. I hate lazy drug metaphors done by people who have no experience of what they're actually talking about, because I'm maybe better. I like the presenters well enough. I think they're quite likeable. That they've run into some thorny issues of plagiarism before, which is a minor epidemic in the true crime bubble, with people just piggybacking off the same resources to talk about the same events. And they occasionally run into the rabbit hole of getting caught up in the most out there theories, because sometimes it's really easy to forget that the crimes that we're discussing happen to real people in the real world. Never seen. They had an episode about a trafficking ring. Okay, because if there's anything that white women want to talk about, it's the risk of sex trafficking. Obsessed with it. In this episode, the presenters had this story about a woman who was asked on online dating profile to meet a guy at a certain bar and order a certain drink, 2 fireball shots. So she goes there and she stood up. And she's like, oh well, only this guy comes sidling over and is there to offer consolation in her moment of plight. She was not really very interested, but the waitress of this bar comes over and she finds an excuse to get her alone and warn that guy who came up to her at the bar did this trick often, that he was often there when women were stood up after meeting someone online and doing this particular 2 fireball shot thing. So I'm there, and I think I was doing sewing. There's lockdown, I'm doing my sewing, ironing out my pieces, doing my sewing, and I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, oh, this guy's a really sleazy pickup artist. I've been online long enough to think, an evil wizard came up with this, one of those pickup magicians came up with this. It sounds like a bit that's in a pickup artist book or on the men's rights subreddit as like the surefire way to get in with a woman. Falsely stand her up and then like come sweeping in as the white knight rescuer. You've got an immediate, you're in there, lads. However, the two hosts take this and they take a leap into absolute moon logic. The clearest example I can think of, like, just moon logic. So, in their eyes, this is not a sleazy fuck wizard who is acting alone. Oh no. This is a carefully orchestrated step in a gambit that is designed to lure women into a nationwide, nay, international sex trafficking scheme. Designed to lure in the most obvious of targets, middle-class young white women on paid-for dating profile sites in the aims of, I don't know, selling them off to the evil brown man across the American border. And it in a way that would be really obvious, leave lots of traceable evidence, leave hundreds of witnesses, and be a really time-consuming and inconvenient way to traffic people due to the time and dedication needed to track women down through dating apps, find out they're in a new area, spend a week or so chatting them up, taking them to a public place, and then somehow taking them from that public place to parts unknown. Bearing in mind you're spending all that time and effort on just the one woman.
My ridiculously circuitous plan is 1/4 complete.
But the presenters are so convinced of their beliefs. They contact the FBI, who have, mail fraud to track down, and they encourage their listeners to do the same, to keep contacting the FBI and about this clear pickup artist bit. They did not take the time to research, investigate, and understand the real nature of trafficking and sex trafficking in our world. That sex trafficking, out of the grand scheme of trafficking, is a very, very small part of that focuses on those who are most likely to go unnoticed by the wider world. Karen on Tinder is not being sex trafficked. The people being sex trafficked are the undocumented queer runaways, those on the very margins of society who are not wanted, are not noticed, and have no one who is there to advocate for them. Trafficking is not done by a man stalking women in public or abducting them from dressing rooms or putting cable ties on the wing mirrors of cars. Trafficking focuses on those the police and society have already chosen to ignore or who do not have the luxury of trusting the police. And you know what the vast majority of trafficking is done for? It's done for the really old-fashioned job of, agricultural slavery. The vast majority of trafficking is done for labour, for factory work, and for agricultural work because, well, you can't focus on those issues because then you have to think about who's making your shoes, picking your food, and cleaning your home. The fantasy of this vast nationwide cabal that is purposefully tracking down white women to force them into sex trafficking is a very much more attractive and comprehensible problem than the reality of mundane background misogyny, racism, and the need for cheap undocumented labour to prop up our society. And therein lies the underbelly of true crime. It carries an illusion of finality, that there is a neat solution to fix a puzzle that was designed to be solved, that there are nefarious, bad people who do the crime. No one else does the crime, it's the bad people over there, and that real life is like a fictional story. It is a genre driven by the unconscious fears of white women. This idea that the dark predator is coming to specifically target you, while ignoring how often crime is a product of an intersection of gender, sexuality, class, and race. It highlights how things could, well, they could all be fixed if we could find the right good guy, rather than discussing how the system breeds and engenders violence, and how we all need to fight and demand accountability and responsibility in the structures that we are complicit in and also have power over us. In true crime, there is an end to the story. You can turn off Spotify, you can turn off the podcast, you switch off your television, you put the book down. You can ignore and pretend as if this vast web that links us all together as both victim and perpetrators of attitudes which cause violence. We don't have to think about how we're encouraged to have a lack of empathy, to build intolerance for the other, to put implicit trust in systems that may protect certain members of our society but intrinsically damage others, and our consumption of bodies of those who are considered expendable. The bodies of victims are exploited by their killers, by the media, and by a system that uses them as a prop. It is the least we can do to grant them dignity in death. These teen girls liking these teeny bopper groups. Honestly, why don't they get themselves a sensible hobby and spend billions putting on an international tournament for a children's card game?